The cream-colored envelope was heavy in her hands, its gold lettering pressed deep into the paper as if meant to mock her. Mr. and Mrs. William Carter request the honor of your presence. The words blurred for a moment as Naomi Carter read them again, this time slower. It wasn't just any wedding, it was his wedding. Her ex-husband, William, the man she had once loved with every piece of her soul, was marrying someone else. And not just marrying, he was inviting her. Naomi almost laughed at the audacity. Why would a man who had discarded her so cruelly, who had left her after years of marriage, want her at his grand new beginning? She knew the answer almost instantly. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't closure. It was humiliation. She imagined William's smug smile as she walked into that ballroom filled with polished guests, whispered judgments, and flashing cameras. The black ex-wife, the one who had been deemed unworthy of his high society ambitions. Naomi held the invitation tightly, a fire stirring inside her chest. Maybe William thought this was his final victory over her. But what he didn't know was that she had changed. She wasn't the broken woman he had left behind. She was ready. The Carlton Grand Hotel sparkled like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers rained light across the ballroom, every corner filled with flowers imported from Italy. Waiters in crisp tuxedos glided through the crowd, offering champagne on silver trays. Guests whispered in admiration of William Carter's extravagance, another display of his endless wealth. At the center of it all stood William himself. Tall, sharp-jawed, and wearing a tuxedo tailored to perfection, he looked every bit the powerful businessman he always wanted to be. At his side was his bride-to-be, Charlotte Whitmore, a socialite with family connections older than most empires. Blonde hair, diamond necklace, a smile carefully rehearsed for the cameras, she was everything society expected a man like William to marry. "Tonight will be unforgettable," William murmured to Charlotte, though his eyes scanned the entrance more than her face. He wasn't waiting for her family. He wasn't waiting for more reporters. He was waiting for Naomi. Guests filled the room with chatter, but William's thoughts buzzed with a single goal, to see his ex-wife walk in, diminished by comparison, a shadow in the glittering hall he now ruled. But as the doors opened, and Naomi finally appeared, every head turned. And William's smirk faltered. Naomi Carter walked through the grand entrance with her head held high. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered with every step, a perfect balance of elegance and strength. Her natural curls framed her face like a crown, her skin glowing under the chandeliers. For a moment, silence overtook the room. Guests who had been gossiping about her, about the poor, discarded ex-wife William had invited, fell quiet as they watched her glide into the hall. Charlotte stiffened beside William. "Is that her?" she whispered, forcing a smile as cameras snapped. William clenched his jaw, though his lips curved into a polite smirk. "Yes. My ex-wife." Naomi didn't flinch under the stares. She had prepared for this moment. She wasn't here to beg or to wallow in humiliation. She was here to show them all, especially William, that she was not the weak woman he remembered. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her movements graceful, unbothered. Her eyes met William's across the room. For a heartbeat, she saw the flicker of surprise in his gaze, the way he hadn't expected her to look like this, confident, radiant, untouchable. And Naomi allowed herself the smallest smile. Let the game begin. The ballroom came alive again, but now with a different energy. Everywhere Naomi walked, whispers followed. "Is that her? The ex-wife? She's stunning. I thought she'd be less. Why would William let her come?" Naomi caught fragments of it but kept her composure. She knew what they expected, embarrassment, shame, maybe even tears. But instead, she gave them grace. Charlotte, however, wasn't so composed. She leaned closer to William, whispering through clenched teeth. "Why does she look like that? I thought you said." William silenced her with a sharp glance. "Relax. She's nothing. Just wait." Naomi moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging polite greetings with people who hadn't spoken to her in years. A few guests looked guilty, remembering how they had once sided with William during the divorce, swallowing the narrative he had spun about her being difficult and unfit for his world. Now, those same people found themselves oddly drawn to her presence. At the bar, Naomi overheard one guest murmur, "She carries herself like royalty." It wasn't part of William's plan. He had wanted her entrance to sting, to remind everyone she had been discarded. Instead, she was commanding the room. And for the first time that night, William felt a sliver of unease. William had always been a man who thrived on control. Even during their marriage, Naomi remembered, he loved to orchestrate every detail, to ensure people saw him as flawless. Tonight was no different. He had invited her not out of kindness, but cruelty. The plan was simple: let the world see the woman he had traded up from. Show her as a bitter shadow of herself while Charlotte dazzled at his side. Then, during his speech, he would make a veiled remark, subtle enough to pass as a joke, sharp enough to wound. He wanted Naomi humiliated. But standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching her command the room with quiet confidence, William's plan wavered. It hadn't occurred to him that Naomi might not break. Still, he wouldn't give up so easily. During the toast, he murmured to Charlotte, "I'll make my point. By the end of tonight, she'll regret ever showing up." Charlotte forced a smile, though her hand tightened on his arm. Naomi's presence unnerved her in ways she couldn't admit. Across the room, Naomi sipped her champagne, watching William with calm eyes. She didn't know exactly what he had planned, but she could feel the storm brewing. And she was ready to face it. Charlotte Whitmore, the soon-to-be wife of William Carter, had spent weeks imagining this night as flawless. Every detail of her gown, her jewelry, her hair, had been meticulously chosen to ensure she shone as the centerpiece of the evening. Yet, as Naomi entered the ballroom, a sharp pang of unease tightened in her chest. She had expected a timid, downtrodden woman, someone who would shrink under the weight of society's gaze. Instead, Naomi moved with a quiet, commanding elegance. Every step drew attention, every glance held grace and confidence. Charlotte forced a tight smile, clinging to the belief that the room's focus would return to her once the cameras captured her in her own spotlight. But she noticed the subtle shifts, whispers traveling faster than she could keep up with, eyes lingering on Naomi longer than they should. Guests who had once admired Charlotte's poise now seemed torn, their admiration shifting quietly toward the woman she had underestimated. Charlotte's unease deepened as William's attention faltered. He had been smirking, projecting control, but now his gaze flickered nervously between Naomi and her. A tension hovered in the air that she hadn't anticipated. Sophia's smile was practiced, confident, but Charlotte could see cracks. She realized that this wasn't just about appearance or wealth. Naomi carried something intangible: resilience, dignity, a calm power that overshadowed both her and William. Charlotte's hand clenched the folds of her gown, her breathing quickening as she whispered under her breath, "How does she make it look so effortless?" For the first time, Charlotte understood that tonight, the ex-wife wasn't a mere background character. Naomi was a force. And the bride, despite every carefully crafted detail, felt herself losing the very stage she had believed was hers. Charlotte Whitmore, the soon-to-be wife of William Carter, had spent weeks imagining this night as flawless. Every detail of her gown, her jewelry, her hair, had been meticulously chosen to ensure she shone as the centerpiece of the evening. Yet, as Naomi entered the ballroom, a sharp pang of unease tightened in her chest. She had expected a timid, downtrodden woman, someone who would shrink under the weight of society's gaze. Instead, Naomi moved with a quiet, commanding elegance. Every step drew attention, every glance held grace and confidence. Charlotte forced a tight smile, clinging to the belief that the room's focus would return to her once the cameras captured her in her own spotlight. But she noticed the subtle shifts, whispers traveling faster than she could keep up with, eyes lingering on Naomi longer than they should. Guests who had once admired Charlotte's poise now seemed torn, their admiration shifting quietly toward the woman she had underestimated. Charlotte's unease deepened as William's attention faltered. He had been smirking, projecting control, but now his gaze flickered nervously between Naomi and her. A tension hovered in the air that she hadn't anticipated. Sophia's smile was practiced, confident, but Charlotte could see cracks. She realized that this wasn't just about appearance or wealth. Naomi carried something intangible: resilience, dignity, a calm power that overshadowed both her and William. Charlotte's hand clenched the folds of her gown, her breathing quickening as she whispered under her breath, "How does she make it look so effortless?" For the first time, Charlotte understood that tonight, the ex-wife wasn't a mere background character. Naomi was a force. And the bride, despite every carefully crafted detail, felt herself losing the very stage she had believed was hers. Naomi moved through the crowd with the poise of someone who had learned to carry herself not for approval, but for her own dignity. Every gesture, every step, exuded quiet power. She smiled politely at acquaintances and old friends, acknowledging them with a grace that contrasted sharply with the tension William and Charlotte radiated. Guests couldn't help but stare. Whispers flitted across the ballroom like wildfire. "She's radiant. I didn't expect her to be so composed. And she's glowing. Pregnancy suits her, doesn't it?" Charlotte's hand tightened on William's arm, her carefully rehearsed confidence faltering. She had expected Naomi to be timid, perhaps even broken, an easy target for William's theatrical show of superiority. Instead, Naomi dominated the room, not through loud declarations, but through the magnetic calm that came from true self-respect. William's smirk had vanished, replaced by a twitch of unease. He realized that all the careful planning, all the manipulation, had failed. Naomi was untouchable, and the crowd knew it. Every whisper, every glance, chipped away at the illusion he had so meticulously built. Even when cameras flashed, Naomi met them with serenity, not fear. Her eyes held a depth of strength and resilience that reminded everyone, including William, that she had endured the storm of betrayal and emerged unbroken. It wasn't anger or revenge that made her formidable. It was dignity. Every word she didn't speak carried weight, every step she took commanded attention. The room, once set for her humiliation, had unwittingly become a stage for her triumph. And as she passed by William, her gaze briefly met his. No mockery, no bitterness, just calm, unyielding strength. In that moment, everyone could see the truth. Naomi Carter had not been defeated. She had risen, and her grace shone brighter than any jewel in the ballroom. Naomi moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to command the room without a word. Each step she took was deliberate, her posture perfect, her smile polite but self-assured. The grandeur of the ballroom, the sparkling chandeliers, and the elegantly dressed guests could not overshadow the presence she carried. Guests whispered among themselves, unable to hide their fascination. "She's stunning. I didn't expect her to be so poised. There's something about her, strength, maybe." Their curiosity was mixed with admiration. Naomi had become more than an ex-wife in their eyes. She was the embodiment of dignity and resilience. Charlotte Whitmore's composure began to falter. She had assumed Naomi would enter timidly, humbled by the invitation, perhaps even ashamed of the life she had rebuilt after the divorce. But Naomi's grace left no room for mockery or pity. The bride realized that all the attention William had hoped to steal from her would now be redirected. William himself struggled to maintain his composure. His carefully plotted humiliation had failed spectacularly. Every whispered comment, every admiring glance toward Naomi was a reminder that control was slipping from his grasp. Naomi didn't seek revenge. She didn't need to. The calm authority in her movements, the serenity in her gaze, and the effortless elegance of her presence spoke louder than any words ever could. She was untouchable, not because of wealth or status, but because she had mastered herself. When her eyes briefly met William's across the room, there was no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet confidence that unsettled him. It was a gaze that silently said, "I am here, unbroken, and nothing you do can diminish me." In that moment, Naomi's grace became the focal point of the evening. The woman who was supposed to be humiliated instead commanded respect, leaving the crowd captivated and William quietly unsettled. The room quieted as William took the stage, champagne glass in hand, prepared to toast his bride and, in his mind, publicly mock Naomi. His eyes scanned the audience, seeking the perfect moment to deliver a subtle barb, a joke disguised as charm. But as he opened his mouth, Naomi's presence froze him mid-thought. She didn't look down, she didn't shrink, and her calm gaze unsettled him more than any applause could. Before he could begin, the event's host gestured to Naomi. "And now," she said, smiling warmly, "we have a few words from someone who embodies strength and grace, Naomi Carter." Gasps rippled through the room. William's jaw tightened. This wasn't part of the plan. Guests whispered eagerly, leaning forward, curious to see how the ex-wife he intended to humiliate would respond. Naomi stepped forward, her emerald gown catching the light as she raised her glass. Silence settled over the crowd, even William and Charlotte were frozen. With a voice steady and warm, Naomi began, "Tonight is a celebration of love, resilience, and the journeys we all endure. Life sometimes takes us through pain, betrayal, and loss. Yet, it is in those moments that we discover our strength. I have learned that dignity is not given, it is earned. And it cannot be taken from you, not by wealth, not by power, and certainly not by someone else's cruelty." Her words were not a personal attack, yet the sting was unmistakable. Every person in the room felt the weight of her presence, the quiet power of someone who had survived and risen above. As she finished, the room erupted in applause, not polite clapping, but genuine admiration. William's carefully constructed plan crumbled entirely. Naomi had spoken, not to humiliate, but to shine, and in doing so, she became the true star of the evening. The whispers in the ballroom grew louder as Naomi stepped back from the stage, her words still echoing in the ears of every guest. William's confident mask was cracking. For the first time, the carefully curated image of his perfect life began to falter. A few brave attendees, old acquaintances who knew Naomi's side of the story, began murmuring stories of William's past behavior, how he had spread false rumors during their marriage, how he had tried to manipulate her into submission, and how his wealth had never made up for his cruelty. The murmurs grew into audible conversations, with more and more guests joining in. Charlotte's eyes widened as she realized the scope of what was unfolding. Her glamorous wedding was no longer about her or William's celebration. Instead, it had become a public reckoning. She glanced at William, who now looked pale, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. Naomi, standing with her head held high, listened without reacting. She had expected this outcome. Her presence alone reminded everyone of the truth, that William had been the manipulator, the betrayer, not her. Cameras flashed relentlessly as guests whispered into their phones and captured every expression. Social media would explode within minutes. Headlines were already forming in their minds: ex-wife commands room with dignity and strength, and billionaire's plan to humiliate fails spectacularly. Even Charlotte, usually so focused on appearances, felt a shift in perspective. She realized that Naomi's power was not derived from wealth, status, or beauty alone. It came from the strength of her character, the grace with which she had endured the past, and the courage to face humiliation without lowering herself. William's plan had backfired spectacularly. The truth was out, and everyone could see it. Naomi Carter had emerged victorious, and the man who sought to humiliate her was losing the battle he had thought was already won. William Carter felt sweat prickling at the back of his neck as whispers swept through the room. Guests who had once been dazzled by his wealth now studied him with raised eyebrows and subtle judgment. His carefully orchestrated image of control and power was unraveling before his eyes. A former business partner, emboldened by Naomi's presence and the crowd's shifting energy, stepped forward. "William, it seems the story everyone knew was incomplete," he said, his voice steady. "There's more to the past than you've led on. People deserve to know the truth." Gasps filled the room. Cameras turned toward William, recording every twitch, every hesitant gesture. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but no words came that could undo the tide of revelation. Guests whispered stories they had long suspected: financial manipulations, betrayals, and the calculated humiliation of Naomi during their marriage. Charlotte's eyes widened in disbelief. She had thought marrying William would guarantee status and stability, yet she was witnessing the unraveling of the very man she had chosen. The reality was clear: the world saw William's arrogance for what it truly was. Naomi watched silently, her expression calm, almost serene. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The exposure of William's character was happening organically, propelled by his own actions and the courage of those willing to speak the truth. By the time William found his voice, the damage was done. Social media was already buzzing, guests were talking openly, and his carefully curated reputation was crumbling. The man who had once sought to humiliate Naomi now faced a room full of people witnessing his downfall. In the center of the room, Naomi raised her glass once more, her calm strength a stark contrast to William's flustered panic. He had underestimated her entirely, and tonight, everyone could see it. Charlotte stood frozen, her carefully rehearsed smile gone. She had envisioned a perfect night, a flawless wedding, a union that would cement her social standing and bring admiration from all around. Yet, in the middle of the ballroom, watching Naomi command attention and William falter, Charlotte realized something undeniable: she had been playing a part in someone else's cruelty. For the first time, she saw William for who he truly was, a man who thrived on manipulation, control, and the suffering of others. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Every calculated word he had whispered to her in private, every promise of grandeur and security, now seemed hollow and tainted. As the applause for Naomi swelled, Charlotte felt a surge of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She could continue to play the obedient bride, a pawn in William's self-aggrandizing performance, or she could make a choice that reflected her own integrity. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte stepped forward, capturing the attention of the room once more. Her voice was steady, confident, and clear. "I've been complicit in this deception," she announced. "But no longer. I refuse to be part of humiliation or cruelty, and I will not stand beside someone who seeks to tear others down for his own amusement." Gasps rippled through the crowd. William's face turned crimson. Naomi's eyes widened slightly, not with surprise, but with recognition of the courage Charlotte had summoned. The ballroom went silent, waiting for William's reaction, but it never came. Charlotte had made her choice. She would no longer be a bystander to cruelty. In that moment, she reclaimed her own power, leaving William exposed and vulnerable, while the admiration of the guests shifted irrevocably toward the two women he had underestimated. Naomi stood in the center of the ballroom, her presence commanding and unshakable. The whispers and glances of admiration had grown into a wave of acknowledgement, guests recognizing not just her beauty, but her strength, resilience, and dignity. The woman William had intended to humiliate had instead become the true heroine of the evening. She took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the moment. Her eyes met William's one last time. There was no anger, no need for confrontation. The humiliation he had intended had backfired spectacularly, leaving him exposed, his arrogance crumbled under the weight of truth. Naomi's silence spoke louder than any words could. Charlotte, standing nearby, offered a small, respectful nod, acknowledging Naomi's courage. Even the most skeptical guests recognized that the ex-wife, once cast aside and demeaned, had claimed her rightful place, not through vengeance, but through grace. Naomi moved toward the exit, her steps purposeful and elegant. Cameras flashed, but she no longer cared. She had taken back her narrative, proving that her worth was not determined by a man's cruelty or society's judgment. As she passed the crowd, people parted instinctively, some offering congratulatory smiles, others whispering admiration. She had turned the anticipated humiliation into a public affirmation of her strength. At the door, she paused for a moment, glancing back. The ballroom glittered with opulence, but to Naomi, it felt hollow, a reminder of what she had survived and overcome. She stepped out into the night air, feeling the cool breeze against her skin, a symbol of freedom and new beginnings. Tonight, she had walked into a trap, but she had left victorious. The woman William underestimated had risen, and nothing could take that triumph away. Days after the wedding, Naomi Carter's story dominated social circles and social media alike. Headlines celebrated her grace, courage, and unwavering dignity. Ex-wife stuns billionaire's wedding guests with poise and strength, read one article. Another declared, Naomi Carter walks away victorious, leaving groom exposed. For the first time in years, Naomi felt truly seen, not as someone discarded or humiliated, but as a woman of power and presence. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. Friends who had once quietly sympathized now openly praised her resilience. Strangers reached out, inspired by her example, many expressing how they had endured their own struggles and felt encouraged by her victory. Naomi smiled quietly at these words, grateful not for fame, but for the validation of her own journey. Meanwhile, William's empire of control and influence began to wobble. Clients questioned his judgment, colleagues whispered about his temper, and Charlotte distanced herself, refusing to be tethered to a man who had shown his true colors in public. What had been meant as a grand display of dominance became a testament to his hubris. Naomi, however, cared little for his downfall. She had claimed her power not by tearing him down, but by standing tall in the face of cruelty. She had reclaimed her dignity, her narrative, and her life. On a quiet morning, Naomi stood by the window of her apartment, sunlight streaming in, feeling her unborn child kick gently. She placed a hand over her belly, a symbol of life, hope, and new beginnings. The past no longer held her hostage. She had rewritten her story, with courage as her ink and grace as her signature. For the first time in years, Naomi Carter felt truly free. She had faced humiliation, betrayal, and doubt, and emerged unbroken, victorious, and stronger than ever.